Alan Wake is a third-person action-adventure game with horror elements that follows famous writer Alan Wake as he arrives in Bright Falls for a vacation that goes horribly wrong when his wife disappears and he awakens in a car, lost and confused. The game is available on PC, Xbox, PlayStation, and Nintendo Switch. Atmosphere. The game switches back and forth a lot. During the day, there's the sleepy town of Bright Falls and Alan's flashbacks to better times, with its comforting small town vibes, and these moments are, at their darkest, slightly uneasy.
Can you believe this place? This would make a wonderful setting for a book.
We're supposed to be on vacation, Alice. I'll figure it out when we get back home, okay?
However, a large part of the game is walking through the woods at night, and it's electrifying. The endless trees and darkness feel almost oppressive, but the atmosphere is really the most impressive just before the enemies flood in. The shadows swirling over the environments, a powerful wind flowing through the area like a hurricane, and the sound of this warbling drone that, along with distorted screams, really make these moments feel special. Something is coming. There's a lot of unsettling story points and a lot of uncertainty that goes on underneath the whole experience. Something the game did quite well was manage to keep the atmosphere going even through some of the combat sections, especially with smaller groups, but the atmosphere was less and less noticeable through some of the more combat-heavy areas, with some chapters being generally more combat-heavy than others, and the atmosphere is sometimes forgotten about as you deal with wave after wave of shooting enemies. Generally though, the game manages to keep itself at least vaguely spooky throughout. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. The game's scares aren't a big focus, and it has very few moments where it feels the game is actively trying to frighten the player. There's an overwhelming amount of combat and its relentless nature does get a bit tiring, but none of it was really frightening. It does have one or two scripted events that stood out as unnerving, but generally in the game's quite long runtime, I can't think of any events that were genuinely frightening. So that's still one Harry Mason. Sound design. Sound is a pretty big deal in Alan Wake, with its haunting, moody soundtrack that comprises of slow, melancholy cellos and ambient drones that's so subdued it blends in with the excellent environmental sounds, crows cawing, thunder rumbling, and the sound of the wind through the trees. Again, like I stated earlier, the sound design during these combat sections is almost overwhelming with how intense it can get, with all the swirling sounds, the enemies saying their incomprehensible lines, and the sound of gunfire punctuating it all. The helicopter section specifically stands out. There's of course the songs that are part of the story, like the excellent Poet and the Muse that ties in with the events of the game. The end chapter songs are a fun addition too. Some of the sound effects are frankly excellent, with the objective notification just being a soft thud of a note that feels unsettling, as well as burning the enemies with the flashlight sound being very pleasing. There were a lot of generic sound effects too, with the door opening one feeling like an old familiar friend at this point with how much use it's seen in various games. The voice acting is great all round, with loads of distinctive voice actors doing pretty great performances. Alan saying his thoughts always sounds dramatic. Nightingale's deranged alcoholic stupor fits in really well with how aggressive he is too. They all just fit, even the radio DJ feels like it's his job in real life. The directional audio and environmental reverb work really well. It's impressive stuff for sure. That's 2 Harry Masons.
And now to see your love set free, you will need the witch's cabin key. Find the lady of the light, still raving in the night. That's how you reshape destiny.
Gore. The game's gore consists of 1 or 2 bloody scenes throughout the whole game that are shrouded in darkness to the point they're not hugely noticeable. Gore wasn't a huge part of the game, and the moments that are in it don't feel out of place. That's 3 Harry Masons.
Please help! Back here. Mr. Wake?
Oh, hell.
It happened just the way it was on that page. I found came true. It knew. So dark. It'll come back for me. You must. The lights in the office.
Story. Famous writer Alan Wake travels to the sleepy town of Bright Falls to take a break from writing and enjoy the scenery with his wife, but after the first night there, she disappears. The island they were staying on vanishes, and he awakens in his car, utterly bewildered. The story has many layers and a lot of things going on that aren't and won't be specifically explained to the player, and is of course initially quite confusing. There are a lot of things that feel wrong from the get-go, but only because it seems like Alan is either lying or being lied to, since his story doesn't match anyone else's. It makes you question what's real and what's a deception for a while, and things like the manuscript pages turning up for a book that Alan hasn't written yet only muddy the waters further. It's really intriguing for quite a while, and the more mind-bending elements of the story, like the song Poet and the Muse explaining story elements, are fascinating, but the song also being key to progressing the game is just great writing. The things that did bring the story down were once again how little the story was present in certain long chapters, with chapter 6 only having story at the start and at the end, with the bulk of it being running from A to B fighting enemies with barely any detours. Another thing was how many references to the TV show Twin Peaks there were. It makes it almost impossible not to notice, with some characters being almost one-to-one copies with slight changes, which does make the experience feel slightly less original. Alan Wake does go its own way, even if it's still mirrored by the show that inspires it. Still, it's a very engaging game that the story is weird enough to keep you wanting to get to the conclusion, making the final score 4 out of 5 Harry Masons. Whilst the game is generally very good, there's a lot of things that I struggled to enjoy about it, with the combat variety being so poor that it feels like you're fighting the same 12 guys the entire game, which really grew to be tiresome near the end, and the Twin Peaks comparison being so blatant that it felt generous to call it a homage. Still, it was a game that I didn't really appreciate until I powered through to the end, and I'm actually very enthusiastic to play Alan Wake 2. Again, I'd like to remind you the whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool. I get it. I'd like to point out that it's not a lake, it's an ocean. Peace.